It's a,
I feel like I should have got a Canon. I don't.
Yeah, you Nikon, right?
Yeah, I know. Actually, they had a sale on this at Costco. Sorry, I didn't buy it.
you're okay. All right. Well, we are officially live, so welcome to Camera Basics. Welcome everybody online too who decides to join today. We got 3 members joining us in class today, so I'll be talking both online and in person. But to kind of get into it, welcome to Camera Basics. Today we'll be covering a few different things, but the idea of this is that you're graduating from a smartphone and you're looking to go into your camera with more confidence, learn how to shoot your subject matter properly, and get a very basic understanding so that way you can maybe go out there and shoot something other than just auto. But we'll go through everything and start talking. So jumping right into it, it's only 5:29. There's a comment on there, I'm not sure. Okay. We'll give it another minute here and then we'll get jumping on. But today as a whole, the way that I'll do this, anybody who talks onto the chat, has any questions for me, I should introduce. I'm Saxon, by the way, to anybody here and then online too. I taught your camera class last week, or 2 Thursdays ago, so I'll be doing it again today. Anybody who has questions, feel free to comment in the chats. The gentlemen here in the room with me too, they're going to comment if they have questions for me as we're going through the presentations. We'll hopefully get this to go till about 6:30, and then from there we'll answer any questions in the last 30 minutes that have popped up, maybe that you didn't ask as this was going. But it is 5:30, so we'll jump right into it. So getting into it, my camera class is going to be helpful in the sense that I'm going to teach you the very basics, but we should also talk about where to go when all else fails for help. And I have my goofy little dog here to help me, but read your owner's manual. They come with the cameras. They're important to learn the function and button functionality of the cameras. While all the cameras have very similar buttons on there, certain cameras have very specific functions. So it's important to learn that. For the example I like to give with the Nikon's newer series, with their Z series, they have a auto eye detection for both animals and humans. That's an important thing to know. With the Canon series, you have different autofocus features and different menu options than you would with other cameras too, so it's important to remember that, and Sony the like. So, there are 2 more on there too. YouTube Masterclass, great resources to look at too. YouTube, they've got great tutorials. I recommend to almost everybody as we're on YouTube right now, looking up your camera specifically, and one of the things I like to key on is 10 things you might not have known about whatever the camera model is. They're goofy little videos. Sometimes they're not exactly what you need, but other times you find out little tips and tricks that you wouldn't have looked up or wouldn't have had known to look up otherwise. So I always recommend 10 things you didn't know about whatever the camera model it is that you're looking at. And Masterclass is another good one. I've used it in the past, but they have tons of great videos and resources that people will walk you through and teach you different things, whether that is the technical aspects of the camera or whether that's more of just tips and tricks. So the first thing we'll talk about other than that is, where do your pictures go? SD cards. Some people will have a more advanced camera, something that'll take a CF Express, Type A or Type B. Others will have a standard SD card. Majority of cameras you're going to see are going to have SD cards. I recommend having an SD card of at least 64 gigabytes or higher, 32 if you're on a budget, but I always recommend having 2 just in case one fails. Idea with an SD card is that it's going to store all of your photos and your videos to your camera properly and then allow you to use those photos and videos later on for whatever medium or however you're using your work. Typically, if you're someone who's shooting video or a lot of video, I would definitely recommend going to 128 as your minimum. Also, if you're someone with a video or a video heavy kind of shooting experience, I might recommend going with something with a much larger read or write speed. It's really important as you're transferring images over from one device to the other. But other than that, I'd say whatever you can afford when you're going through this or as you're upgrading your camera, shoot for a high gigabyte storage with a good transfer time or a good read-write speed. And have 2 of them. Hi there, sir. Welcome in. Have a seat wherever you'd like. We have another person joining us.
Is this taking you?
It is not. No, you may sit down. Anywhere you'd like. Anywhere. Those are just the setup.
Oh, okay.
So we're teaching the camera class both in person, and then we're also doing it online. You are in at perfect timing, though, because we literally just got about a slide or two in. I like to put this quote on there: "The bitterness of poor quality remains long after the sweetness of a low price is forgotten." Idea with this one is you get what you pay for in any regards. So the cheaper that you go on the camera, typically the less features you're going to get, more so the less quality you're going to get. With cameras, it all comes down to the physical electronic components of them. The better the components are, the better the image comes out. So when you see a camera that goes for $2,000, $3,000, the megapixel sensor, the ISO, the f-stop, all of that is included in there, and it's going to be a higher number or a better number than something that starts at that $500, $600 range. And that's typical with most cameras. So it's important to remember that it might not be necessarily you who's not shooting a good photo. It could be the physical camera itself. Now, jumping into that, we're going to look at this little guy, which is your picture shouldn't live on your memory card. When I say that, I basically mean if you're taking photos and you're just leaving them on your memory card, you're doing it wrong. The possibility of that memory card either failing or something going wrong or damage is very high. So not only having two memory cards or SD cards is important, but making sure that you are offsetting those photos and finding ways to get them off the SD card in a safe place is important too. So don't lose your pictures or damage your card. Turn your camera off, wait 5 seconds, then remove your card, place in card reader. It's very simple, but it's something we should talk about. A lot of people, and I've seen this before, some photos won't actually load onto the physical SD card, and you'll notice photos are gone, missing from the physical SD card. A lot of the times it comes from the fact that you're not removing or properly taking out your SD card. One of the things you can do, or a list of things that you can do right here, is very simple, safe practice. So turning off your camera, making sure you switch it completely off before you remove the SD card. Waiting 5 seconds. This is a general rule of thumb, but again, if you turn the camera off and you wait 2 seconds, you should be fine. The idea is to wait, let the camera turn off, let the shutter on the inside close, so that way you know that the sensor is turned off, the physical camera is off, and then it's safe to remove the SD card. Placing it into the card reader. Don't use your camera to read the card or send pics to your camera. So what we're trying to say there is basically, if you're using your camera, a lot of the newer cameras have features where you're able to transfer the photos to your phone. It's a great feature on there. Most of these newer cameras have Bluetooth or Wi-Fi ability. It's a great tool to have, and I like to throw it out there for like vacation. If you're on vacation with the family or you're doing something somewhere where you don't have access to a computer, it's a really nice feature to be able to take the photos off of there and then send them to your phone so you can share them with people as you're going. That does eat the battery up like crazy, and I do warn against that. But it's a nice feature to have, but don't rely on it. Use a good card reader. Lots of different card readers out there. These are ones that we have. I typically recommend something that can read or write at least 1 to 2, or at least 2 SD cards. The Trifecta, for example, can do both regular SD cards and micro. The Velocity 1, or the Velocity Scene that's on the right there, that guy can do a CF Express and an SD card. So again, very beneficial. Sony, that's a CF Express reader. That's for, again, the higher end ones. But one thing that I've noticed before in the past, a lot of people go off the old school of thought, plugging your camera directly into the computer and then transferring stuff off. It's fine to do it that way, but some of these newer cameras, they don't necessarily process the same way like the old ones do. So I always recommend remove your SD card physically from your camera, insert that into the computer via a card reader, and then remove your images from there. It's helpful. And then this goes back now, we're continuing where we were before. So, copy photos to a destination folder. Don't move, copy. We say that. So with SD cards, you got a couple different things. So when you physically take a photo from an SD card and you move it over, you're creating a copy of that. Why we want to create a copy is because just in case we lose a file, we want to make sure we have backups of the files. Everyone that I talk to has a horror story of losing photos and never being able to retrieve them. A lot of the times it comes from a very simple move that we can make, which is just storing the photos in 2 different places. So we'll talk a little more about the 3 different examples that I have. But it's important that when you're doing this, that you remember that a photo or the photos as a whole can be saved in copies and in multiple forms. So what I like to do personally is I'll take the photos off the SD card. I'll create a folder on my computer. I will move the photos from the SD card onto the physical folder. That will then save them into the folder, keep them onto the SD card. If I so choose to, I can then delete everything off the SD card, which a lot of the times I do. That allows me to reuse the SD cards. If you're someone who wants to make sure that you have photos all the time, I would say leave the SD cards, purchase new ones as you're going. It might be silly, but it might also be the saving factor of, oh, I lost 100-something photos, or, oh, no, I didn't. From there, if I have the photos on my computer in a folder, I like to also then save them to one more place. So with my photos, I save them directly to my computer, and then I use an external drive. So I use option C as far as choosing. An external drive, typically you'll see them, let's see, there we go. Top right corner is a great example of an external drive. An external drive is going to look kind of like a mouse pad. It's going to be a little square, maybe about 4 by 3 inches, 6 by 2 inches, and it's going to act as another hard drive. So similar to your computer, you've got a storage system inside the computer that can save the photos. The hard drive is going to do the same thing. Benefit to this is that if you leave the hard drive at home and it's your backup for your photos, you drop your laptop in some water, spill a cup of coffee on there, everything's gone. You've lost everything. The hard drive still have everything on there. So I'm a huge fan of the hard drive. I keep all of my college artwork on a hard drive and all the way into the photos and stuff that I'm doing today. I've been a big fan of the hard drive saving solution. Going back to that, Prime Photos, Google Drive. Those are great examples of cloud-based services, and I'll get a little more into that as we continue. But an external drive, like a terabyte hard drive solution, or a cloud-based solution, is a great way to store and save your photos. Both are going to offer you protection in case something goes wrong. One of them is going to be digital protection, and one of them is going to be more of a physical protection. And then the last couple things, eject the card before physically removing it. If you're using a Dell or Windows-based computer, on the bottom right corner you should see an icon where you can click and properly eject the computer. If you're using a MacBook, if you click and hold the physical SD card and drag it to your trash can, it'll safely remove it. You want to do this because at the same time, I can't necessarily guarantee you'll lose photos if you don't, but I have seen horror stories of people losing a lot of information on the SD cards, things not being written properly, and then they go back in to try to get those photos out. They're not there anymore. So it's important to make sure that when you are done getting photos off of your camera and SD card onto a computer or cloud-based solution, you properly eject it before you physically just pull the whole thing out. And then going back into this. So we talked about the hard drive. That's an SD card, which we've talked about. Those would be your first 2 kind of ways of defense. You have the SD card, if you so choose not to delete any information off of that. You have the hard drive, which is going to back up the images. The physical computer, that would be your third or your second option in the long run of things. You're plugging the SD card into the computer, you're pulling the photos off of there. They'll save onto the computer first, and then you have the option of then sending them to either the hard drive or the cloud. Now, cloud, a lot of people get really mixed up and they don't understand what a cloud-based service is. But the best way to think about it is that your computer has a set amount of memory. Your phone has a set amount of memory. Those SD cards, that terabyte, all that has a set number for your memory. Cloud-based solution does not. Most cloud-based solutions will give you unlimited data depending on what you pay for, what your services are that you're signed up for. But what's nice about that is that whenever you make an account for these cloud-based storage solutions, you can then take the images and send them directly there. So Google Drive is one of my personal favorites. Almost everybody has a Google account nowadays. You can take your regular photos, save them to your Google Drive. And what happens is if you log out of that computer, you get rid of your Google on that computer, let's say now you go across the country, sign into another computer, you can access all of those photos anywhere you are in the country, anywhere you are in the world, as long as you have internet. A lot of people like this solution or like this route because then it prevents them from having to need a hard drive, which they could lose, damage, break, etc. And they can just focus on keeping everything under one account. Where it's saved, it's safe. Both are good options. I am someone who's very physical, so having my hard drive at home, I feel better knowing that it's there, it's saved. Versus Google Drive, I don't have any issue with that. It's just not my personal favorite way of saving. A lot of people do love the cloud-based solutions, so I definitely won't deter you either way on that. But I definitely would say the big takeaway on this, it's important to not just save your photos to the SD card or the computer. You always want to have alternative routes so that way in case anything goes wrong, you do not lose your photos.
If I have them on Google Drive and I took some pictures with my daughter, I can give them to her very easily.
Yes, you can as well, too.
Okay.
So within that, the question was asked, can then, when I take some photos on the Google Drive and they're there, can they be shared with other people that I choose? Yes. Most of these cloud-based services will allow you to attach other emails or usernames who then can also access your files. Typically, you just have to give them permission to do so, and that's a couple clicks away. Very easy switch. Yes.
How long do hard drives last today? I have two at home that have gone, they've crapped out. I mean,
How long?
They're dead.
How long are they? Have you had them for?
Over 10.
Over 10. I mean, in my experience, so the hard drive I've had of it has at least lasted me about 6-7 years. That's the mark I'm at right now. I've seen hard drives go all the way up to 15 years, depending on them. It really comes down to that kind of goes back into that quote that I posted with Benjamin Franklin there. It comes down to the quality of them. I'm not sure on how expensive the drives were when you purchased them. I know that the more expensive ones tend to have a little bit better internal hardware, and they're made out of a little bit better materials. So typically they'll last longer, but nothing with technology is foolproof. So there's always errors that can occur and always some things that can happen. So my recommendation in that case would then still be looking at the cloud-based stuff. But I would say you should get at least 10 years out of a hard drive, a good quality one. I think I got mine from the store here for $40, $50 a few years ago, or like I said, 6-7 years ago when I was in college back in the day. And I mean, it still lasted me. I plug it in every day. Haven't had any issues with it loading up. So, yeah, I would say it's the quality. In about 10-15 years, you should get out of those things. Other alternatives to cloud-based solutions. So we talked about Google Drive. OneDrive is one that's made by Windows, made by the guys who do all of your Word and Microsoft. That's what I was thinking of. It's made by Microsoft. And then Adobe Creative Cloud. I'm a huge fan of Adobe Creative Cloud. I think it's really beneficial. If anybody is interested in editing photos, playing with video, taking stuff afterwards and editing it in post, Adobe is the way to go. Their Creative Cloud is a monthly based subscription, but it gives you access to things like Photoshop, InDesign, things that can allow you to better your photos. And they also have classes, little tutorials, and videos on there too. So when you sign up for their monthly service, not only do you get access to their editing softwares, but then you also get access to all this other artwork that people are making, all of these other videos that people make that then can kind of help you determine how to use your camera a little bit differently. It's a nice solution. It can get a little pricey depending on which tier that you sign up for, but definitely worth looking at them. A tour of your camera. So let's break down the buttons on the camera. Now these pictures that I have, the cameras are going to maybe look a little different than what you currently have, but the idea should be the same. So we're looking at a Nikon, so you're in luck with this one.
Thank you.
But basically, easy tour of them. So you have your video start and stop. So we'll start with the power switch. You got to turn the camera on and off. So you have your on and off button on the top there. It should be close to the trigger for the camera, or the shutter release, if you will. But that'll be the way that you turn it on and off. Typically, it's a dial that you turn left or right. After that, we have the video start and stop. So you've turned the camera on. You have a shutter release that's right below the power switch, or in this case with the Nikon, it's right in the direct middle of the on and off. Underneath that button is the video record. So if you're shooting on the camera and you want to go to video, most cameras allow you, once you click that red dot button, to start shooting video. Depending on the setting that you're on, depending on how much storage is left in the SD card, your camera's smart enough to notify you what's going on with that. For starters, I always tell people to start on auto. The goal is always to get away from auto, but The best way to take a clean, concise photo that you know will actually give you results afterwards is auto. From there, we have our exposure comp. So by clicking the exposure comp, it's going to allow you in the viewfinder or on the screen to physically see what your light and exposure looks like. So what that's going to be able to tell you is if you're using a setting where you have an aperture priority or a shutter speed priority, it's going to break down the amount of light that the camera is able to pick up and give you a more detailed explanation or give you a more detailed understanding for why you should switch or what you should be switching and turning the camera to. Typically, as you move the dials on the camera and you're changing the shutter speed or the f-stop, you're going to notice that the light meter on there will physically move one way or the other. Best thing I can say is that trying to keep that light meter dead center means that it's going to take a perfectly even photo as you're using it. Now, if that's not the case, depending on the area you're in, you might want to go a little higher or a little lighter. But my recommendation when you're looking at that light center, you want to keep it directly in the center. Below that, we have the mode dial. So, like I said earlier, I always recommend for beginners to start with auto. We'll go through the mode dial a little bit later in the video, or in the presentation, but the idea with the mode dial is that you can set whatever it is that you're trying to shoot. So if you're trying to shoot in manual, you can do that. If you want to do auto, you can do that. Then there's also going to be aperture priority setting, shutter speed priority setting, a video dial that's typically on there, and then with this Nikon specifically, they have a scene one on there, which just gives you extra exposures, extra stuff to play with. On the side of your camera, you'll see a flash button. That's typical if you want to open up the flash or control the flash on there. If you're shooting in manual, the flash should automatically be down. When you're shooting on auto, the camera should be smart enough that it picks up on light in the area and then is able to determine whether or not it needs the flash to go up or down. Function button. From a function button, there's two different things. On certain cameras, typically the older ones, they automatically take you into a menu setting where then you can change and control things. If that's not the case, then it's a button that you can physically set and control based on what you want the function to be. So for some people, that could be a more advanced menu setting that you can then click the function button and have quick access to your menus. For others, that might be switching to a video mode where it then pulls down the light meter for the video, puts you directly into the video shooting, and then you can go ahead and click the video button when you're ready to start.
Mine doesn't have a function button, it has a VKT. Is that similar to it?
Should be similar to that. I'll have to play with that. We can find
Okay.
out. But I believe that's going to be similar.
Okay, thank you.
From there, we'll go to the front. You got a zoom ring and a focus ring. So depending on the lens style that you have, if you have a all-in-one lens, telephoto lens, or in this case, they have a telephoto that's more of a wide angle to a portrait lens with an 18 to 55, that zoom ring is going to allow you to move through the subject matter, change the focal length. So that's beneficial. With an 18, you're looking at something much wider, not overly wide that you're going to get distortion, but more of a landscape variation for if it's for a shot. Instead of it being narrowed, it's going to kind of go all directions on the sides, get a much wider view. And as you move into that 55 area, that's going to be more of a portrait prime. That's going to be the least distortion for subject matter and give you a really clean image of the person. Lens retract. If you do have a lens that's a telephoto lens that can go variable adjustment, so 18 to 55 like this lens does in this case, the lens retract button is going to be the button that keeps the lens locked so that way it just doesn't move on accident in your bag. That's my best way of describing that. If you're traveling and you have everything, sometimes the lens itself can get a little bit shaky inside the bag. That might cause the lens to open and close a couple times or possibly kind of mess up the gears that are inside. So they have, on most lenses, on some lenses I should say, a button that allows you to keep the lens retracted inwards, and when you're ready, you hold the button, and then you can actually unlock the lens. I've had a couple customers who come into the store, they think their lens is broken, they don't understand why it won't retract from the camera body, and it's all because they just didn't click the button. On there, then there's also the lens release button. That's another question that I get that comes up a bunch is when you are using the camera, especially a DSLR or a mirrorless, how do you physically remove the lenses from the camera? there's a button on the side that you click inwards, and then you're able to rotate the lens counterclockwise, removing it from the body, and then allowing you to put another lens of some sorts on there. And then drive mode button. When you're shooting your camera, the drive mode button, which usually looks like a timer with a line going through it or has squares stacked up on each other, that's going to be how your camera's shooting. So is it single firing an image? Is it taking one photo at a time? Is it taking a burst of images? Is it taking multiple photos when you pull the trigger once? That's manual focus and autofocus for you. It's a little bit different for yours. And yeah, we'll go into more detail with your guy. And then drive mode being the when you're shooting, do you have a timer on there? Some people will actually set it so that they can put the camera down, set the timer for 10 seconds, walk away, get a photo of themselves, and then walk back to the camera. A lot of the features on that are kind of going away though, because of the fact that you can connect your smartphone to your phone, or your smartphone to the camera with the Wi-Fi Bluetooth, so it kind of acts as a smart remote. So you don't necessarily need to set that timer anymore. You can set your camera up, make sure it's on you, walk away, look at your phone, make sure it's centered on you, and then pull the trigger from wherever you're sitting or standing. Now we go to the back, and this is where it might benefit you more, because I think all of your buttons are going to be basically on this side for the most part. Menu button, that's going to take you into the menu settings of the camera. So a lot of the times, things that aren't f-stop, aperture, things that you're not controlling on like a finger touch basis, those are going to be located in the actual menuing of the camera. So that could be the hue and saturation of the images. That could be the color of the image. That could be the autofocus and how that's setting up and how that's pointing. A lot of the times, autofocus is the deterrent for bad photos. A lot of people don't understand how to use focusing on the camera, and so when they take a photo, they get upset that they've taken a bad photo when it's just they needed to play with their autofocus feature a little bit more, or they're focusing. Diameter adjustment, just like a pair of binoculars, we all look through glass a little bit differently. So the diameter allows you to play with the adjustment of the eye, so that way it's giving you the correct focus on the subject matter. Sometimes when you put one of the viewfinders or the rangefinders up to your eye, it feels a little blurry. You change the diameter, it fits your eye better, and then you can see clearly through it. So it's important to play with that as you're going. Info button. Typically the info button is going to do one of two things. It's either one, going to show you the info for the photo that you just took, or it's going to give you a better info of whatever is happening around you. So for instance, if we were to go down, I'm going to jump a little bit, but we have the image playback button. If you click that button, it should show you all the photos that you've taken on the SD card, old or new, whatever you have saved to that SD card. If you find a photo that you like and from there click the info button, it should give you more information as far as what number image this was that the camera took. So you can kind of get an idea of shutter and how many times that shutter has been closed and opened. Should then give you another information of a timestamp, a date stamp, depending on how you set your camera up. Then from there it should give you coloring metering. This is where you're going to see you're going to see an RGB format, and it's going to kind of look like a ramp almost. But what that's going to do is break down how the camera was able to decipher the colors, and it gives you a little bit more information. As a beginner, probably is nothing that you need to focus on, but as you get more advanced and as you play with it, the color and how you're viewing that saturation could become really important and good to view. Underneath that, we have the I button. The I button is going to act as your way of changing the physical settings on the camera. So let's say now you are in the manual exposure of the camera. You click the I button. This should then give you access to your aperture. This should give you access to your f-stop, to your autofocus control, to anything that you need on the fly as a photographer. When I say the fly, I mean as in like as you're taking the action of the photo. It's great to stay on auto. Camera should be calibrated. It'd be great out of the box to give you a clean image. But setting it to either that aperture priority or f-stop priority, being able to communicate and play with those a little bit differently, the I button is going to give you access to all of that as you're shooting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, if not today on the intermediate. But the OK button, again, that's a pretty straightforward one. Click OK, that'll get you to whatever the setting is that you're trying to go to. It won't do anything if you're not on a specific thing, but let's say that you go to menu, you're scrolling through, the multi-selector will help you scroll through. For Nikon, it's a ring, For other brands, it might just be a key pattern of an up, down, and left to right. When you find what you're needing to click on, you click the OK button, and that should either put you into the settings so you can manually change it, or it'll OK you out of it if you've already changed something and you want to make sure you save it. Sometimes if you click the back button or delete button, it'll take you back, but it won't necessarily save. So it's important to read the camera's screen bottom as you're changing settings on there to make sure the OK is not your save button. So that way you actually save what you need to save if you're changing settings.
OK and set button are the same, right?
Yes, OK is the same as the set. Magnifier button, you've got demagnifying to, when you take an image, depending on the image size and the camera sensor size, that'll allow you to zoom into the photo. It's a really easy way for a photographer as you're shooting to see the crispness of the image as you take it. So that's one of the things I recommend with it. If you set an autofocus point on the camera, and let's say we're looking at this these 5 family members sitting down in a circle. On the little girl's face, maybe you set your autofocus to be on her face, and when you go to look at the image that you just took of the family, you zoom into her. That would be your clear indication as you're using your demagnifier and your magnifier as you zoom into her to see the clarity and the clarity in her face. That should then tell you how your autofocus is, if you need to readjust, and then from there, different settings to play with it. But that'll be the magnifier and demagnifier. So you go into the image itself with your image playback, and you're able to play with the image from there. And the delete button is pretty self-explanatory too. A lot of the times when you delete a photo from the card on the camera, it's going to ask you if you're okay with doing that. You'll click OK again, and then that'll usually delete the photo. A lot of buttons on the cameras, a lot of different ways that you can switch between things. I think the most important thing to remember that anything you set on the camera, you can always turn off or turn back on depending on the setting. So my recommendation is to play with the different settings on there, play with all the different buttons, get more understanding of them. So that way when you do make changes, you know where you made the change, you're able to go back, turn that setting on or off depending on what you did set. Now we'll get into the dial mode. So the mode dial, and it's important to remember that every brand is going to do it just a little bit differently. So the bottom I have Sony. That's what a Sony dial button would look like. On the top right corner I have I want to say that's Canon. And then on the left side there I have the Nikon. And I could be wrong on that one, but
No, that's the Nikon.
Nikon's on the right?
No, left.
The left, okay, good. Awesome. So yeah, for the most part, they're all going to have the same things. Some are going to have differences between them, and that's what makes all the different camera brands different. It's how they understand and they play with the photo. So jump into the next slide. I break them all down. So auto or A+, depending on who you have, they'll have it a little different. Auto is going to be auto control over settings and functions of the camera. For any beginner, I always recommend going to auto. This is where you should start. This will show you the basic ways to push through a photo, how to actually take an image, how to make sure that you're centering your image upright, and other stuff that we'll talk about today. But auto is your friend as far as beginner to camera. You just upgraded from a smartphone, you purchased a DSLR or mirrorless camera, start at auto, and read the manual, attend classes, go from there. Manual, that's the M on the camera. That's full manual control over the camera's array of functions. So by going to manual and that I button that I was showing you earlier on the screen there, if you're on manual and you click the I button, this will give you control over every little bit and piece of the camera. Typically the big things to talk about are ISO, aperture, and f-stop. Those are the 3 most important parts of your camera. There's other features on there that you can learn and play with, but if you don't know those 3 and you're using the manual setting, those are the 3 that you're going to need to basically know everything about all the cameras. Now, going into that, with manual, you can control all of it, but let's say you don't necessarily want to do that. You don't necessarily need to have all of the control over the camera. Maybe you just want to control the aperture, which will control how much light is being let into the camera, or maybe you want to control on shutter speed, which is going to then determine how fast the picture's shutters close. A or AV for aperture priority, S or TV for shutter speed priority. I really don't know what the TV means. I get AV, but TV doesn't really make a lot lot of sense to me. I've been trying to figure that out for a while. S makes sense for shutter. A for aperture. But regardless, aperture control, and this is where it gets a little tricky, and it's very touch and feel over a camera. Aperture priority is going to determine what it is for the physical aperture and how big or how small it's going to be. Aperture is then what's going to be letting in light. So you can set it to the lowest aperture setting or the highest aperture setting, and that's going to determine how much light comes in. So when you take a photo and let's say everything looks whitewashed, there's not enough contrast, you don't have shadow where you want it, it's probably because you had the aperture at too low of a number and you let in too much light. The higher the aperture goes, the smaller the hole goes. And I believe we talk about that on another slide, if not the intermediates. But it's important to remember that if you're taking an image and you have this setting on, you want to play with the number that you have to figure out where the sweet spot is. And there's really no sweet spot. ISO, people will always say if you're shooting and you have ISO set on the camera, 800 is the perfect spot to be in when you're indoors. And then anything outdoors, you can go to higher number depending, or set it on auto. I personally always shoot with my ISO at 800, and then I have an aperture or shutter speed priority on top of that. Shutter speed. This is going to be how fast the shutter closes. There's a lot of different ways that you can do this. I'm a big fan of keeping a middle of the range shutter speed to start with as a beginning shot. This will then help me determine whether or not I close too fast or I closed too slow. The higher the number with the shutter speed in the reverse of aperture, the higher the shutter speed number, the faster the shutter is going to close. The lower the shutter speed number, the slower it's going to close. It's a good way to think about how much light you're letting into it too. The faster that shutter speed closes, the less amount of light that's going to come in. The slower it closes, the more amount of light that's going to come in. So this also helps with where you're shooting. Are you outdoors? Are you indoors? Do you need to worry about how fast that shutter's closing? Do you not need to worry about how fast? The other thing too that shutter speed can be important about is movement with the object. If your object is let's say you're at a track meet or you're at the Olympics and you want to take a picture of a runner on a track, you don't necessarily want to get them at a slow number, at like a 1 or I can't think of the numbers off the top of my head without seeing them. But you don't want to go at a number that's going to go too slow, because then what's going to happen is that runner, that Olympic guy, they're going to look like they're all blurry. They're not going to look quite right. The faster you go with that, the more of a still that you're going to get of them. So if their arms are pumping and they're running, rather than get the blurriness or the motion behind that, you'll get them on a smooth, still image. P is program. Aperture, shutter speed are auto, but everything else is changeable. So now this is the flip side of manual. Aperture and shutter are already going to be auto, but now you can control the ISO or the light meter on the physical camera and just play with light and anything else that they have to offer depending on the camera brand. That could be the autofocus, that could be the filter and coloration of the photos, that could be anything. And then the camera is fully customizable, but as long as you're holding the shutter release, the camera will stay open. So there's a great example I should have in this presentation of the 4th of July fireworks. A lot of the times people will take a photo of the 4th of July fireworks, but it almost looks like they have every firework that blasted off in the sky all in one photo. And that's most likely because they used the B one. The B setting on there will basically keep the shutter open the entire time with whatever settings that you have programmed on there. So it could be auto for this one. It could not be auto. It might be you have everything set up the specific way that you want it. The most important part is that by keeping that B on, you'll be able to open up the shutter, open up the camera, and allow for the camera to see everything in front of it for as long as you can. I always recommend, if you're using this setting, it's so important to use a tripod in order not to get any blurriness of your actual subject matter. The camera can take a photo with the bulb open for, B stands for bulb, I should say. But the camera can take a photo for as long as you need it to, and it can give you the perfect amount of light, it can give you everything. The big thing with it is that it's going to show you everything that's in front of you, but it will blur things if they're moving. So it's important, if you're using the B function, keep it on a tripod. and it should at least keep the background, or keep the subject, or the foreground I should say, and any filler parts of the image in focus. Everything else that's moving in the background should then get captured. Great example is fireworks.
I tried
No, yeah,
that. I couldn't get any fireworks the way I wanted. Sorry.
no, you're okay. But that is something, and again, it's something that you can play with. Looking at some of these other dials on here, you have the Scene Intelligent Auto, which I know is important. It's another form of auto. Basically, if you have that A+, it means that the camera has a little bit more as far as the autofocus is concerned, as far as, what's the terms I'm looking for? It's not just going to play with setting the camera automatically so you can take photos. It'll do a little bit more of intelligent reading of a scene for you. So scene used to be a big part of the Nikon cameras, and it basically was another way for you to play with extra settings that gave you more features. Scene Intelligent Auto in this case is going to give you an automatic view, or an automatic experience with the camera, with that old scene technology and that old, more controllable, integrated technology that Nikon used to put all into one now. So if you see the A+ on the camera, that is your auto. It's the same thing as the old scene buttons used to be, but now they're all combined. Looking over, you got the same features on the Canon side, except for no flash is an option on there. And just like Nikon used to do scenes, Canon's big on doing portrait, landscape, kids, photo, macro, or nighttime. Those are very similar. Portrait is going to take a clean portrait photo. If you've got the person in front of you, you want to do from the shoulders up, or maybe a full body. Portrait is going to keep the subject matter in the front of you in focus, and then should blur out the background. Landscape is going to kind of do the flip side of that. Landscape's focus is to get the entirety of the scene, not just focusing on one person. Kids, the idea behind that is that they are going to be smaller. They're going to be tiny. And so when you're taking photos of kids, sometimes the level that you're on, especially if you're pointing a camera downward, or even if you get on the level of the kids, sometimes the lighting on them can be a little bit different as opposed to a full-grown adult. I know that sounds silly. But with the kids feature on there, it just gives you a little bit more control over the fact that you might be pointing the camera downward, and by doing that, you might be losing sunlight or certain aspects that are coming into the subject or into the photo. Sport, similar in the sense of movement. It's watching you as you're moving the camera, as you're going through, and making sure that, let's say you've got someone who's running in front of you, you'll get a clean, one quick image of them, and they'll be in stride rather than blurry or motioned. Macro, close-up photography, nighttime photography. Heavy areas of darkness, and macro is extreme detail on smaller objects. You'll hear that term with lenses a lot, macro lenses, and they do make specific lenses for, let's say that you want the detail of a flower or a beetle if you're in nature. You can get your camera close depending on the millimeter size of the lens, take the photo, and the idea is that it's going to take the most detailed photo of the subject that it can. Some people need macro, some people don't. It's dependent on you. Depending on what you like to shoot too. Like I've been saying since the beginning, start with auto. That's everyone's best friend. Definitely recommend it.
You see that?
Yeah, I think auto is, that's the best way to go. Now with the rest of them, this are more of them. So now, like I was talking about before, there's scenes, and then there are the scenes that then Canon offers too. Nikon's slowly getting away from them, and I believe now the R series, you guys don't have the scenes button on there.
Yeah.
You do have scenes on there.
I have seen them.
Yeah, you have the scene button on yours, and then you have the same. Okay. Yeah, there it is. Okay, perfect. Yeah. So similar aspect. Using those as a beginner photographer is a great way to get introduced into what you're using, but remembering what those settings do is important. I wouldn't want to use the sports photography for a portrait photography. In the case for you, I might use the sports because of the birds, with the birds flying and everything else. Birders are very huge in photography. If you see a bird going across and you want to get a good image of it, a lot of the times, depending on their wings and the shutter speed that they're going at themselves, you get motion with a lot of birds or with a lot of animal photography. So it's important that you remember the shutter speed when taking pictures of wildlife. That's hugely important. It'll help out a lot. this is my favorite. My camera doesn't work, and then these are the images that I see with it. A lot of the times when we're taking a photo, it's just that we're not using the settings or the controls properly. And that's where we can then play with it and then put into practice everything that we just talked about. Another little slide here, but your camera isn't your smartphone. I get a lot of people that come in and that's the big thing, is they want something that takes something similar to the smartphone or takes a better image than a smartphone, and it will, but it always is going to start with you, the photographer. You've got to have the eye and the vision to take the photo, and sometimes playing behind or hiding behind the guise of, oh, once I have a real camera, then it'll be a lot better than having my cell phone. That's not necessarily the case. But it's important to remember, I guess it's not on this one, but it's important to remember the difference between a snapshot and a photo. Cameras are notorious for taking high quality photos. Some people can turn those into snapshots where it's a quick image that they're taking of it and then they're moving on from there. But in reality, that's more of the purpose of a phone. It's a quick photo that you're taking, really no thought into a snapshot. You're just getting a quick image off. With a photo, you're being deliberate. You're taking your time, you're investing time and money and effort into learning the materials for it. And so a photo should be treated like art, regardless of how you want to, how you're using your photography or not. So thinking through the image, and that's where using your aperture, your f-stop, your ISO, using the different controls and features on there is extremely important. It gives you more control over the camera and really helps teach you how to do, and really helps show you how to take a proper image by kind of teaching or guiding you through it versus just pointing your phone at it and taking an image. End story. Holding your camera, this might seem silly, but it's something that we really got to talk about. I get a lot of people that talk about how their back hurts when they're taking photos, or how it just doesn't feel right the way that they're taking pictures. And let me move my little screen out of the way so you guys can see. There we go. Can move me over to the corner there. So we can see on the screen here, there are two different ways that everyone's holding the cameras on this one. On the left side, the gentleman in the Gap shirt, the top left is an example of how you do not want to take your photo. With your hands, you want them to be comfortable. You have to remember that you're cradling in your hands about 4 to 6 pounds depending on your lens and then body type. DSLR cameras are typically going to be heavier than mirrorless cameras. But a lot of the new mirrorless cameras are going to be shooting full frame, which means they have more components in them, which makes them a little bit heavier. So something like the RF series that you two gentlemen have is going to be a lot heavier than a Sony camera. By a pound, by an ounce, depends on the model that you have. So it's important to remember fatigue over time, having a neck strap, having a hand strap, great accessories, but making sure that you're properly holding onto the camera, not only for your own stability, but for the image's stability sake too. When you're gripping the camera in the proper way or proper posture, you're going to have better control over the image and how you're choosing to shoot and then take that photo with better control over your arms, your shoulders, and your back, which all go into it as you take a photo. The worst posture that you can have would be on the bottom image, where we see the first picture of her leaning backwards on that. You're putting a lot of stress on your neck, you're putting a lot of stress on your shoulders. Taking a photo will not be fun. Leaning forward too much, kind of same example. Now you're putting more stress on your lower back, which is going to prevent you from wanting to take photos, especially if you have to go lower with them or if you have to bend over. It can all be frustrating points. Having good posture, having good balance with the photos, and then hand placement. The most important thing I would say is hand placement. Keeping your hand on one hand on the lens and one hand on the body. The body is going to be your main control. So you're righty, you're holding it with your right hand. That's going to be where you're setting your apertures, you're setting your priorities. Holding it on the lens, if you're a manual lens focuser and you do not like to use autofocus, having your hand on the bottom of the lens will either give you control over the zoom ring or the focus ring. Important as you're shooting. Video over again. Put you guys back in the top right corner there, and then we'll jump to my next slide. So focus, then shoot through the picture. A lot of the times when I meet new photographers or when I go into understanding your camera better, one of the things that I've learned is that people like to just take the photo and then focus afterwards. And that's not really how this works. When you're taking a photo, you have to focus first. And typically a focus on any camera is a half click or a semi-click of the shutter release button. Shouldn't be new information, but for some it is. Making sure that you are physically holding down that button in a half click to make sure that your camera focuses in on the subject matter. You'll hear the gears rotate, or if you're a manual focuser, making sure that you're rotating that ring on the lens to make sure that you're actually getting a clean version of your image. Is important. When I started shooting on film, the way that it works is that you would see a double basically of the other person in the camera, and you would sit there until then basically both were overlined with each other, and that's how you knew that you were taking a clean focused image. That does not happen anymore. Now you'll see it right away inside the viewfinder on the LCD screen. The person will be very blurry, and then all of a sudden they'll come back into focus, and that's how you know that the autofocus is working properly. If you are moving or the camera is moving, your photos will get blurry. I can't explain that enough. A tripod, if you are someone who needs a tripod, is important. If you're someone with shaky hands, relying on the neck strap or relying on a hand strap can be beneficial. I would say the neck strap more importantly. If you can keep your neck and your shoulders still, even if you have shakier hands, you can pull on that neck strap, make it nice and taut with your neck. That'll at least help you keep more control or grip over the camera. But using a tripod is the same idea too. Tripod's going to allow you to keep the camera on a base. All you have to then do is maneuver the camera in whatever direction that you want it to go, and then take your image. When in doubt, use a tripod. If it's not something that's available to you, I definitely recommend using that neck strap technique. I even have some people that really have a bad neck, bad hands, so what they'll do is they'll actually use their thighs or their knees for the photo. If you can keep your elbows on a table or elbows on locked into your body, you can also take a better crisp image. Alright, basics for taking great photos. So this now we're just going to go into some small little details on how to make sure that when you're taking a photo, how to read and register what you're doing with that photo. So fill the frame. From the image to the left to the right, we can see that on the right they're using a prime lens, a portrait lens of some sort, most likely a 50mm, to seeing that she doesn't look distorted in the image. From left to right though, we see this image with a bunch of negative space around the subject. The negative space isn't helping the subject in any way, and it's also kind of keeping detail away from her where we can't see necessarily the hair, we can't see the necklace, we also can't see the earrings as well. Filling the frame, cropping in the image, and in this case not just taking the photo and editing in post and making it tight, but physically getting closer to the subject matter and filling the frame really helps open up the detail, opens up the color, and then also gives us a little bit more to play with as far as detail is concerned.
The opposite is very true, though.
Yeah, depends. It really does depend on it.
What are you saying? The opposite?
You're cropping in too close on a subject, and you realize that, oh my God, I wanted to get the rest of that shirt. He had a cool looking shirt or something. I mean, It's just you get too tight. When you're pan out a little bit more in post, you can go in and you can get that crop. But to get a really great picture, do it the first time.
Yeah.
I
Or take two.
The key, the one thing I will say with going inwards, like you with the R5, you have a great camera that is a full frame that you can then crop into a photo, and if you need to, you can do that. For someone like yourself with the 7200, the megapixels are a little bit lower on that camera, not necessarily as high as this one. So the image that he would take as he would crop in would get blurrier. So in this case, I probably would recommend taking 2 images, or at least multiple images. One where your subject matter is not necessarily filling the space, so that way you have the ability to crop in if you choose, but then also having that cropped in image so that way you have a cleaner cut portrait. In this case, I mainly put this towards portraits. I wouldn't really throw this in a lot of other scenarios. A lot of the times I do feel like, in your case, yes, not filling the frame, having things a little bit more open, gives you, the photographer, a little bit more to play with. But it depends on your camera.
both ways.
Yeah.
So if you use Adobe Creative Cloud, you can make that image better, or once the image is done, that's it?
Well, so once the image is done, that Creative Cloud will give you that ability. So no matter what, if you're shooting in JPEG or if you're shooting in RAW, and RAW is a whole different thing. I don't really talk about it in the beginners. I talk more in the intermediate about RAW. But when you're shooting a standard JPEG or RAW or even a photo on the iPhone, you can always bring it into Adobe afterwards and edit it, change it however you want. That could be the color of it, that can be the black and white of it, that can be taking certain things out and using blending tools to maybe, let's say, get rid of part of her hair to accentuate more of what's behind it. There's a lot of different touch-up tools that you can do. Now, I will say this much, that the Adobe Cloud or Adobe programs will allow you to play with the image only so much. It always is going to come down to how you took the photo and where and what you have available from the photo. It's the same thing like with video. If you're editing a video, you can't really just create things that you didn't film. You need to film it first. So when you're shooting photos, I always recommend take more photos than you necessarily need to. And you can always edit the bad ones or edit the good ones in post and fix up what you like and don't like. There's also ways to take two of the same images if you're using a tripod and actually blend and split together. I have a lot of people that do that, where they'll have a really awesome portrait shot of a family, but maybe the kid has a goofy face. And so they'll have a clean image of another one where the kid has a perfect face, and they'll literally Photoshop the face over, and you couldn't tell the difference between the two.
You could do that.
Yeah, there's ways to do that. Eyes in the top third. So if we broke this image down into three different quadrants or sections, you would see, and we'll talk more about the rule of thirds, but you would see that the eyes of the subject matter are closer to the top of the image rather than the center or rather than the bottom. Our eyesight as humans, we're drawn as we look into a human. The first feature that you notice, typically, you make some form of eye contact with somebody. Your eyes then break towards other things depending on colors of shirts or maybe what they're wearing, what they're doing. There's a lot of different things. But we always have those interactions as humans where we make awkward eye contact with somebody on accident. The first thing we're usually drawn to is the eyes by nature. Keeping eyes of a subject matter, whether it's an animal or a human, in the top or upper portion of a photo, not only opens up the frame for the body, which can add a little bit more creativity or add a little bit more, like you were saying earlier, a cool shirt. Maybe the animal has a really cool spotting on the fur on their chest. That could be a really nice way. If you position the eyes a little closer to the top, you'll get a little bit more of that extra part of the subject, and that could really make or break the photo, make it pop a little bit more. And then going back into that, focus on the eyes. Focusing on the eyes is important with the photos. Nikon is awesome because they have an automatic eye focusing system for both humans and animals. They're one of the few that do that. But when you're taking a photo and you're setting up focus parameters on the physical camera, typically you can set it to where it's a single autofocus point, it's a mid-range autofocus point, and then full frame autofocus point. I would say in this one you're either setting a 1 point or a mid-range. You don't want to shoot the whole frame because you don't necessarily care about the focus in her hair, you don't necessarily care about the focus on her shirt. You want the eyes in particular, the eyebrows, and kind of that triangle between the eyes and the nose. So focusing in on the eyes of the subject matter leads to a cleaner, better photo. Get on their level. Now this is where I was referring to the kids earlier with one of the scenes. Kids move around a lot, they're smaller in nature, and because of that too, typically when you take photos of them, they kind of look like this, where they're a little bit blurry, there's a lot of motion, and you're really not sure what's going on in this, but you know it's a birthday party. Everyone looks like they're having fun. Getting on the level of the kids, so like this is a great example. This would require the photographer to not just sit from the top view and take the picture at the kids' table at the birthday party. This would be physically getting a little bit lower on the subject and then taking in an eye sight or eye view. As you can see from the two photos, going from this photo to this photo, the lens itself is probably no different. It's a 50mm, 35mm lens. It's not a very wide angle on this shot or on the other shot. But what's really making a difference is that there's a focus on the eyes. The eyes are towards the center of the image, but they are closer to the top third of the image, I would say. At least the right eye is on the subject. And then on top of that, he's in a clean focus. You can see his eyes clearly. The focus is on him. The sister is in the background. She's the third part of the photo, I would say. And the cake on the far right side has the more detail to it as well. But the focus is on him, and this also plays on the rule of thirds too. So you're getting on the level of the person, you're focusing in on the eyes, and now you're playing in the rule of thirds, which we'll get into in a little bit here.
Is this on what setting? Give me the control.
On this one, something like this is probably going to be done on either I would say aperture priority setting. It's not necessarily going to be autofocus you can do automatically on there, and your camera has it too, because you have the switch between manual and autofocus. And we'll talk after about that, because I think that's really going to help you. But in this case, I would say it's an aperture priority setting, because with aperture, the higher the number is on the aperture, the less light that you're allowing in. So by doing that, with the aperture, as you're getting closer to so there's a large section of apertures, right? So you can go from the very small one, which gives you a pin-sized hole, to the large one, which opens up the entire iris of the camera. That function of aperture is going to apply to the graininess of the photo, and then how the subject matter in the front relates to the subject matter in the back. I know it doesn't feel that way, but it does. When you have a number for the aperture set towards the middle, depending on, again, what you're shooting, you're going to get more focus on him, less focus on her, and a cleaner image in the front. So I would say an aperture priority setting would have been used to take this image. Autofocus would have probably been kept on. Maybe the artist decided to use manual focus. But the idea was to shoot the subject matter, keep him in focus, and blur her out a little bit without losing everything about her. Aperture would have been done to do that. Or having aperture priority would have allowed that photographer to do that, take multiple photos and see at what angle they needed it, or what aperture setting. Or lower. This is the second part of that. Getting on the level of the person or getting lower than them. For this, being lower than the subject matter, now there's another rule that's being added in here, which is sunlight, which should be on the next slide, but keeping the sunlight towards the back of your subject matters. It's the rule of thirds. Keeping the subject on the back of your subject is going to help a lot. If you are facing the sun as you take a photo, you'll notice that the photo becomes whitewashed. If you are facing behind the sun is allowing for natural light to come onto the subject matter, and so as a photographer, the sun is behind you, and so all the actual direct sunlight is on the person. That should light them up, allow you to use less ISO, and then also allow you to play with the light meter, so that way you're not allowing as much light into the camera because of how much light is saturated onto the field. So for wildlife photography, playing with that aperture is important, but also seeing where your light is with you is important.
Absolutely.
Too. And then rule of thirds. So I mentioned it before when I talked about the boy in that one photo, but the rule of thirds divides the image into 3 quadrants. So you can look at it in two different ways. You can look at it as horizontally 3 quadrants or vertically 3 quadrants. The idea is that where those intersections happen on the photo or on the square, that's going to be the sweet or juicy spot for it. Or it's going to be in the direct middle of those quadrants. And I've got examples for that. But there are actually ways on the camera where you can set these guidelines up. And I personally, when I'm shooting with my camera, I have these guides on my photos every time. I'm a big fan of it.
You like to see them in the viewfinder?
I love to see them in the viewfinder. I know it's always a little goofy, but I can always guarantee that I'm going to get the shot that I'm looking for when I have these set up, versus trying to sit there and like fiddle and then look back and be like, well, they're
Come on, you're an art major. You should be able to do that.
I know, but still, I'm an amateur photographer at best, but I understand cameras really well. That's what I like to say. So this is a great example of utilizing the rule of thirds. We have a surfer here. Number one, we got the sun behind their back, which I really like on this photo. You're getting good light that's coming in, that's giving the camera better coloration and better saturation, but you're keeping the light behind the subject matter, which isn't oversaturating them, at least not to a negative point for the camera. Your aperture is probably going to be a little bit wider in this case, because you're not necessarily getting the subject matter in full focus or the background in full focus. You're keeping everything on a very similar playing field with this one. And then as far as the rule of thirds, if you look onto the right, you've got the middle or the right line that's going horizontal, hitting the subject matter perfectly in those points that we were talking about. And then this is something I like to talk about, but the horizon line on the physical photo. You've got the beach. The horizon line is going to be where the sun and the water hit. If you're looking at landscape, it could be where the building and a ground touch. If you're looking at trees, it could be where the trunk starts from the ground. But when you look at subjects, our eyes are naturally drawn towards natural horizon lines that we find in our sight. So with that, keeping things above or below the horizon line is important to keep in mind. In this case, there's more emphasis drawn on below the horizon line on the physical foreground of the beach. We see his shadow coming off from the ground that's being set by the sun that's behind his back, leads to a more appealing image, makes our eyes more drawn to the subject, which is our surfer. Beach photos, extremely popular in these. I don't really know why, but these are the images that I chose. We got another beach dweller. The horizon line is in the back. That's going to be where the water and the sky meet. Now we've got the girl on the opposite side, but we have all this negative space to the right. And that's going to be the seaweed that's on there, the water, the sand. More emphasis on the foreground than on the background. Background being the sky, foreground being the water and the beach. But what we have here is our subject matter has all this detail. The sun technically is in front of them, but because of the overcast and cloudiness, the sun's not overbearing on the subject, so it's not necessarily bleeding out the image or whiting everything out, making everything oversaturated in color and light, and it helps that it's a black and white photo too, so any of those intense shines that you would probably see or glare coming off the water, it's probably mitigated from that. But we have her in the rule of thirds. Now this one's a little different because in the other one we had a shadow that cast basically from one end of the photo to the other end of the photo, almost giving us a complete straight line. In this case, she's sitting perfectly, shoulders right at that first crossing on the top, ankle right at the bottom crossing. So she's hitting between 2 points. That's keeping her in a third of the image. Again, our eyes are more attracted to that. They're drawn to that. It leads to a more pleasing image. Does it work every single time? No, but this is a great rule to follow when you're first starting and when you're first getting into it. Now we have 2 on the rules of thirds, but in this case we have, I would assume, a daughter and a son, and then husband and a wife. Daughter and son are in the foreground, husband, wife in the background. We don't have anything to really play off horizon this time. There's no sky meeting the ground. There's a couple buildings, but they're all descending into a vanishing point that's all the way behind them. Not necessarily important, but if you did want to throw that in there, the way that the buildings curve back as we're looking at the image are important to remember. They're all going towards a horizon line that's buried behind the image that we can't see, with one dot pointed in the center. It's called one-point perspective in the drawing world, but in photography, it's kind of ascending lines going backwards that, again, they help our eyes and help us navigate an image. But you have your kids in the foreground, the husband and wife in the background. Both are sitting in those crosshair lines, which also applies to the rule of thirds. And then we got Jim from The Office. The way that The Office did this, I really enjoy how they would do these little segments of interviewing people, but they followed this almost to a T. Our eyes are more pleasantly drawn to him as we see him standing on the side of the physical screen rather than him being completely in the center of the screen. There's more to look at, and rather than filling the space like we had just talked about earlier, this is keeping him in a square that basically keeps him off-center just enough that we're more likely to keep a look at it for a longer period of time rather than just kind of push it off to the side. Talking about it earlier, sun on your back. So in this case, we can see that with this bad and better photo. So bad photo, the sun is behind him completely. There, you really don't get any forward light onto the subject matter. The fish looks dark, he looks dark, just doesn't look right. He opens his body up a little bit more. You can see that the photographer shifted just a smidge because you can see more on the right side of the boat than you could on the top, or less on the right side than you could on the top. So he or she moved to the right, opening up the sun, keeping it on the back, but allowing for more sunlight to hit the fish, and then by doing that, it also lit him up a little bit more. Another small thing I might say, ball caps, baseball caps, can be your nightmare when you're taking photos of either with yourself or of subjects. If you're wearing a baseball cap and you're on the camera, you're covering up parts of the camera that do get affected by the light. So it's important to turn that baseball hat around when you're taking a photo. If you're taking a picture of a subject who's wearing a baseball hat, I like to tell them to hike it up on their head a little bit more. That'll open up the face more, allow more light to come in. It doesn't look like there's any difference between his hats in this photo, and I feel like this is a game of trying to see what image is different. But on the bottom one, you can see that by moving the fish out of his face and by changing the angle so the sun is directly on his back as opposed to just not quite there on the other one where I can't tell where the sun is behind him on the first one. But on that second one, I can clearly see the shine of the sun coming from behind him. I know that it's behind him, and from doing that, the way they positioned it, it's lighting up the fish, the subject matter, and his face. None of it looks dark. It looks proper. And one of the last things I have on here is using your timer and camera app. I've talked about it before with especially the R series. The ability with that and with Sony, any of these guys, you can use your phone to control so much from the camera, all from the touch of your phone. So you can be sitting down, having the camera on you or a bunch of people, and you really can play with the physical phone. That'll control all the different settings on the camera. Lastly, we're going to look at just some recommended accessories. I recommend getting all of these things if you don't already have a bunch of them, but I would say the biggest thing to get started with, have a bag, have a battery for the camera, have the memory cards, and then have your external hard drive. Everything else is an extra that I think could be added on. I think they're important in the long run of having cameras and shooting, but I think to start off, your bag, your extra battery, your external hard drive, and your SD cards. Those are the 4 things that you really need to get started. Bag to protect it, extra battery in case that you run out while you're shooting. Nothing is worse than that. And then having a bag to store it all in so nothing gets damaged as you move, and having the proper ways to save everything. And that's where I'm going to end and open up everything for questions. I went over about 10 minutes on the slides. But next week we're going to be doing the intermediate class. That's the one that will be going more into the f-stop, aperture settings, learning what focus is going to do what, and kind of just going into more further detail about that. But I open the chat up to anybody who is talking online here or watching online. Please comment with any questions. And gentlemen, what questions can I answer for you guys?
I have a mirrorless camera, and some of the things that I think we were discussing, I cannot find it here.
Okay.
So maybe you can show me.
Let's
that.
take a look. Here. While people are messaging in.
So, first of all, you said there's something that is a mode. If I look at this is my mode here.
Yeah, so you have
So, what do I have?
So you have 3 different modes. So yours is a simpler camera, the EOS M100 here. So you have auto, which is going to be that auto plus button that we were talking about earlier. That's going to give you enhanced scene detection and give you more information there.
This is the automatic, right?
That's the automatic.
Okay, so I look, this one here.
That is going to be regular photo that gives you full control. That's going to be your manual setup.
That's the manual. Okay, and the last one here?
Camera. That's going to be your video camera. That's going to let you take
So I basically only have the choice between the automatic and the manual.
This version of the camera is going to be a simpler one, gives you a little less control than some of this one, but it gives you 3 basic functions. So automatic, and a camera that you can then control fully manually, and then a video that then you can also use.
Okay, so now if I, yes, if I open it. Now, so the question is, when I'm looking at the menu here, I have all these different things, I don't know what to do with them. So it has like,
So these are a lot of settings that don't necessarily change anything for your photo. These are more so going to change things for how your photos or videos are being saved. So we're going to go right to the first one. Image quality, you're shooting in RAW. RAW allows you to take the photo onto, let's say, like an Adobe or a Photoshop and do more full edits to it. You have more things to play with color. A lot of people don't like that, so they'll actually set it to JPEG. That's an option that you have on here as well too.
So which one do you recommend?
I recommend, do you edit any of your photos afterwards, or do you just take the photo as is? And
Sometimes I edit it, yeah, so.
how advanced is the editing that you're doing? Is it just changing color? Is it
Yeah, a
just?
little bit changing color, that's not too much.
And I would definitely recommend shooting in JPEG. I would say shooting in.
So when you edit the image quality, how do you move around?
So you can use the dials on the side there, or you can physically click it and then just touch anything that you want.
Then
I would start with
is it set now, I just go
Yep.
back?
Just
where?
hit-
Just say, okay.
yeah, okay. So you can hit that center button on there, okay, it's perfect. And then it's gonna give you more, so aspect ratio, so how the image is on the screen, like what the size of it are gonna be. That is going to be the review for it, so after you take a
Okay.
photo,
Now, so the other thing is, when you said here that the shutter that can stop in the middle. Okay, does this have stop in the middle?
well, yeah, so here, when you're shooting. So we focus in on our subject, we've got a little button there. As you click in with it, it then puts that square around it. That means that now you are focused.
Okay, and.
Jujitsu is what my son is now taking.
Flash here to.
Good thing.
automatic, so it's like,
But that's helping him as a
Yes.
policeman. He takes it with
Now,
other
just
policemen
like how I
too.
was showing on the camera layout,
What I
there's
like
that
about
button that
the
you click
martial
to make the
arts,
flash come out.
it teaches so much self-control.
It's that right there.
Which one?
I
Close it
My
back
daughter
up. Your strap sometimes covers it.
had
Pull the
a
strap
lot
up a little
of
bit,
issues,
and you'll see it.
so I made her take karate. She hated
Very
it.
good for a
She
lot of
was
kids.
So upset.
Right here, you
She
see that
just
little
didn't
line?
like it.
You
I
can
said,
just
it's gonna help you focus. She
Just
said,
right.
when I get done, can I go take my
Now,
arc
pull that
class?
forward. Down.
I kept a lot of kids
And when
off
you're
the
ready,
street
you can close it
from
back up,
going
just
into
fold it
gangs and
backwards.
stuff. And one whose
And
mother,
another thing is, so
I was
so,
willing to give him a scholarship, so he didn't have to pay any fees.
Why is it?
But his mom wouldn't bring him, and he ended up in the.
and-
Yeah, I don't know if he's dead or alive now. I mean, I don't know,
How this?
but he's in gangs now.
My daughter tried to take her life a couple times,
This one,
because she
So
was
this
big
cover
and people
is
bullied her.
specifically for the.
She says, I
when
don't
you
want to
take this
hurt
off.
anybody, Dad. It
So,
has
just what we
nothing
were
to do
talking
with
about,
that.
there's a button on here that opens the shut, opens up the camera thing, so
She's
that
doing
you're
good
able
today.
to do it.
That's good.
This is the orientation lock that you were talking
Going
about.
on her
earlier.
third kid.
Push up on this,
Mhm.
and then it'll allow you to change all of it. And when you're not doing that, you can lock
I'm
it
gonna
back
come
into
next
place.
I hope to see ya.
Yeah,
Nice to meet you.
nice meeting you too.
And then when you want to use those covers, that's where then you'll take the lens physically off.
so if I move it up, what does it do now?
Now you can move the camera out of the lens line. And now you can twist.
I
You
say
gotta
sir
hold up,
because I forget
you gotta
names.
hold it at the same time, and
Stuart.
twist.
Stuart.
There it goes. That opens it up for its lock. Now, if you want to use those end caps, thank you for coming. I'll see you next time.
So, okay. Now, when would I want to take it off? When I want to put a different type of lens?
Yeah, so that's where,
Yeah,
get it all the way to the end, pull up on this, close that again,
yeah.
and then there's this button right here on the side.
This is the one.
Push that button down, and then you
Yeah.
twist the lens at the same
Okay,
time.
so you said that this one was there. No,
So that doesn't go there, it goes on the other side of the
yeah,
lens.
there's another one. Okay. Does this one go here also?
No, that one goes on the camera body itself. So when you take the lens off,
Yeah.
so you're holding down the button, let's turn the camera off. Too, when we're doing this. So when you're taking the lens off, you hold the button down, turn it counterclockwise,
Mhm.
this comes off. You then take that, and that goes right onto here.
So I'm supposed to take this off when I store it over there?
If you want, other people will just take it off so they can put another lens on there, so it depends on how you want to do it.
Okay, how do you, from where do you push it?
You push the button down on the center there,
This one.
and then you can turn counterclockwise. You gotta push and pull at the same time.
So, is there any other cover that normally that people can put on top of it?
And there's a lens cap. Did you get a lens cap for it?
No, I had only these two.
Okay. So then, yeah, you probably want to get a lens cap for it, and that's gonna be something that's 49 millimeters. I'm surprised, they usually give you that.
So I can buy it here?
I think it should have. Yeah, absolutely. Talk to one of the salespeople downstairs, they should be able to have one for you.
Yeah, okay, so, no, I just,
So make sure you line them up with the dots, and you wanna be careful too, because here's what happens.
yeah, it's that.
First off, be careful of doing that, because if you damage that, you damage the whole camera, and then you can't take another photo, right? make sure it's dot to dot on there, and that then you're turning clockwise. Dot to dot, and then clockwise once you hear a click.
Okay. Okay, so I should try to see if they have a.
See if they have a lens cap cover that'll protect the lens on there, and be careful when you're taking the lens
And
out.
I bought it from you guys, but what they gave me, this is obviously not appropriate for the case. See,
Yeah, so you got a wrong size case, so you want to make sure you get a case that's big enough for both the lens and the camera.
yeah, okay, so. Bought it a couple of years ago, but I didn't use it because my wife does say, this is, me trying to start again.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so.
Talk to the guys downstairs, they should be
Yeah.
able to hook you up with the other pieces that
Yeah.
you need to complete everything, but then come next week, we'll go a little bit more into the settings and details.
Okay. Okay, Saxon.
What's the Saxon?
Saxon?
Yes.
Okay, good.
What's the advantage in prime lens compared to zoom lens?
So with a prime lens, you're gonna have it where it has one continuous f-stop on there. So
Okay.
let's say you get a 50mm lens for 1.8 f-stop. That means that it's going to allow the camera to go to an aperture of 1.8. And
Okay.
1.8 is one of the lowest numbers you can get where it's gonna let the most amount of light in.
Okay.
With a telephoto or a zoom lens, you move from just having one prime. So if I have 50, I'm able to see from this angle.
Okay.
If I have 50 to 200, I can then move closer to you
yeah.
and get more, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
See you next week. That's going to be the main difference. Typically, too, with the zoom lens, it's not going to have one continuous f-stop. It's going to move from one to the other. So that can be, like the one I'm very familiar with is a 24-70. It moves from a 4.3 f-stop, usually to like a 5.6 or a 6 f-stop, depending on the lens. That's going to be the big difference. Then the other difference with telephoto and prime is prime is
Yeah.
going to give you one, no zoom, no
No
change.
zoom,
That's what you
yeah.
get. Good walking around lens, good portrait lens if you want to do like a nice shot of a family and maybe the dog is sitting really cute, you just want to get a good photo, awesome. You're out and about, you're moving around, you see a bird in the far distance, you want to zoom in with that, get a little bit more scope on there so that you can actually get a picture of that bird.
So for like a wedding situation, you use prime or zoom lens?
For what kind? For what?
Getting when the people do pictures.
Group pictures prime. Prime would be perfect
What's
for
the
that.
best lens you recommend? You know?
For your
So
home.
mine is RP Canon.
I would say, 50mm is a good way to start. 50 is going to give you less distortion on the, so like, I shoot with a 35mm lens personally.
Okay.
I shoot with 35 because I get better landscape,
Landscape.
and I still get good portrait, but my portraits are a little bit tighter, they're smaller. If I go to my 50mm, I get a cleaner image of the portrait, but I get less space to get landscape.
Yeah, but they have a STM motor on it.
They have the STM with yeah, they have the STM, and then they should have is it USM? I think that's
USM.
USM is the other one.
USM.
If I remember, I believe the STM.
STM.
STM is going to give you a better image. It's going to have better glass on it. And the USM is going to have a little less. The best way to look at it, look at the lens for the RF series. The red ring is their higher quality lens. So I believe that's STM. And then their intro level is the USM, and that's just going to be the glass and how much light they're allowing.
So 50mm.
50mm is great for the family portrait. You're just trying to get a nice, clean shot of everybody.
Thank you.
Of course. What else you got? Any other?
That's all. Come back next week.
Yes,
Thank
I
you.
have more for you.
I have one question.
Of course.
I've been messing around with this.
I'm going to end the video real quick because it looks
Okay,
like nobody
sorry.
else has questions. Everybody have a great night. I didn't see any other questions in the chat there, so if anything comes up, feel free to call the store, email myself. I'm saxon.katowski@app.com. Next class, I'm going to include that on the slide so that way you guys can see it and shoot me emails if you have any questions. But thank you guys for staying tuned with everything. Have a great night, and I will see you next Thursday for intermediate classes. That is going to be, let's just make sure I got the date for everybody. That is going to be Thursday the 14th. So 7/14, we're going to